how he equates nationalism with what this seminar proposes, the mind. So when Chittaranjan Das called C. Aurobindo the poet of patriotism during the Alipur bomb trial, well, what he was basically referring to was C. Aurobindo being a poet and a patriot together. So C. Aurobindo's writings and development of thought were one continuous process from 1893. The year in which he returned to India after spending almost 14 years in Britain. C. Aurobindo's engagement with nationalism is not simply a political movement with territorializing India as a geographical entity, nor is it a force to re-establish a connection with an elusive national past to reclaim the identity politics of the colonized. C. Aurobindo's nationalism is an engagement with a metaphysical and a spiritual quest to find the perfection in man as a state of being, and to make the collective a manifestation of that individual idealism. To a large extent, C. Aurobindo's concept of the nation is a thought process arising out of the tenets of universal humanism, where every individual contributes to the social and political progression of the nation as individual forces connecting the larger collective consciousness. It must be understood that while reading the ideas of nationalism of C. Aurobindo, one cannot read them as a materialist projection of ideology or simply a materialist post-colonial response to the construction of India as a nation. But rather, C. Aurobindo's notion of the nation does not arise out of an engagement with the apparatus, but as a narrative of spiritual engagement between the collective force of the people and its manifestation in the nation. C. Aurobindo's concept of India as a nation is constructed from the perspective of spirituality, which C. Aurobindo calls the Sanatana Dharma, as he equates the nation with the mother, the feminine force of birth, and considers the nation a sacred extension of man's spiritual quest to connect with the divine ideal. So C. Aurobindo notes, and I quote, that nationalism is simply the passionate aspiration for the realization of the divine unity in a nation, a unity in which all the component individuals, however various and apparently unequal, functions as political, social, or economic factors. So Aurobindo's idea of the nation is, by its very inception, eclectic. He does not consider the nation as an abstract construct or an ideological space, but his notion of the nation is very experiential, of course, at the spiritual plane. It is true that one of the political aims of post-colonialism is to reclaim the past of the nation in order to challenge the colonial construct of the history. But C. Aurobindo's concept of the Indian past is rooted in the ideas of the syncretic values as proposed in the Sanatana Dharma, which believed in the unification of the body with the spiritual force of the being to produce an eclectic vision of individual, of the collective existence. For C. Aurobindo, the main influence was, of course, the ancient Sanskrit texts like the Gita, the Upanishads, and the Vedas. To C. Aurobindo, it was an intellectual battle to codify the tenets of this new nationalism, where the country is primary and its freedom is the primary goal of individuals, as well as the collective spirit of Indian society at large. And therefore, he, while criticizing the Congress Party in the New Lamps for the Old, where he says that an institution is a very different thing. It was made for the use and not at all for the worship of man. And it can only lay claim to respect for as long it is beneficent to the actions of the memory of the past. So, C. Aurobindo recounts a personal experience of spiritual revelation during the Alipur bomb trial case in 1919, where he passed through a phase of intense spiritual doubts. A critical look at this narrative is important to shape our reading of Sri Aurobindo's notion of India as a nation, which he calls God's purpose. And this is what he writes in one of his essays. I quote, "I was not only to understand intellectually, but to realize what Sri Krishna demanded of Arjuna, and what he demands of those who aspire to do his work, to be free from repulsion and desire, to do work for him without the demand for fruit, to renounce the self-will and become a passive, faithful instrument in his hands." What emerged, and this is very central to our understanding of Sri Aurobindo, what emerges from this secluded communion with God is a realization of the supra-rational potentiality of man, whereby he is able to create a synaptic connection between the finite and the infinite. Therefore, to Sri Aurobindo, India is a collective manifestation of this supra-rationality, through which it has played and has the potential to play as the leader of a world consciousness of spiritual emancipation. So therefore, as a kind of side note, we can say that Sri Aurobindo was already putting his criticism of the new liberal capitalist economy coming from the West. So he observes that India has always existed for humanity and not for herself. And it is for humanity and not for herself that she must be great. In the narrative gaze of Sri Aurobindo, nationalism is not catering to a geographical landmass with imagined borderlines for the production of power. To him, nationalism emanates from the individual and traverses towards the collective through a synaptic connection of the mind. The individual's supra-rationality directs others to join in a collective mission to make the nation state a perfected image of that supra-rationality. And that is where India becomes a unique proposition in the world order of states. Such was the perfected state of spiritual realization in Sri Aurobindo. Much like Swami Vivekananda, he found the trees, the walls of the jail, and even the prosecutors and judges and manifestations of Vasudeva. Not the mythical Vasudeva, but the world, the global consciousness. Ethically speaking, Sri Aurobindo moves beyond the Hegelian dialectics of moral binaries and traverses to a space where these binaries are non-existent. In a moment of revelation, Sri Krishna reveals to Sri Aurobindo, and he quotes, and I quote, that this is the nature of the nation I am raising up, and the reason why I raise them up. Thus, the nation is not a geographical symbol of power or a tool to further racial or religious exclusion, nor is it a mechanism for territorial expansionism. To Sri Aurobindo, the nation is an expression of the collective supra-rationality in man.
That's 8 minutes. Just 8 minutes.
Okay. So, Sri Aurobindo's criticism of the Europeanized mind makes him a post-colonial activist, no doubt about that. And he says that India requires, quote-unquote, Brahmatej, the mythical power of Brahma, that is. But he warns that what the Europeans mean by religion is not Brahmatej. I think we need to appropriate this idea today in 2024, very importantly. What the Europeans mean by religion is not Brahmatej, which is rather spirituality. The force and energy of thought and action arising from communion with or self-surrender to that within us which rules the world. The supramental consciousness that Sri Aurobindo advocates for is a collective force or the will of the entire population, spiritual will, mind you, that will direct that population towards an understanding of their origin and how they can use that energy for the collective good of the nation. Therefore, Aurobindo says, quote unquote, the kingdom of Swaraj is within you. Thus, what he says is that Swaraj should awaken out of the psychology of maiden nations, quote, and hence Swaraj that awakens out of the supramental consciousness of a race is more permanent and indestructible than the one that arises out of external political movements. Right. Here I have given a little, kind of a contrast between Rabindranath and Sri Aurobindo, even though talking about Rabindranath in front of Riyadh is rather quite scary, but I'll still be a bit brave and say that in Rabindranath, the individual is the center of the universe of intuitive consciousness. And to Sri Aurobindo, the nation is the sacred, the absolute center of consciousness that connects the individual to the larger intuition of the yogic spirit. So he writes a letter. He writes a letter where the importance of the psychic being has been underlined. This is a letter that he writes in 1936. So I quote, "The psychic has two aspects," says Sri Aurobindo. "There is the soul principle, S-O-U-L, there is the soul principle itself which contains all soul possibilities, and there is our psychic personality which represents whatever soul power is developed from life to life or put forward for action in our present life formation. The aspect of the psychic affects the way a nation develops into a system with no repression. The co-opted notion of repression between the citizens and the state is diluted if the psychic becomes dominant in the emergence of society, since the psychic creates a space for individual freedom in understanding his role in relation to the nation. To Sri Aurobindo, the role of the citizen is to merge his interests with the larger interests of the society or nation through the potential force of psychic energy, and that is when the state ceases to become an instrument of coercion." So, Sri Aurobindo constructs a shift in the idea of nationalism by shifting the telescopic focus on the psychological aspect of nation building from the intellectual to the political. The theory of the nation coming over to India through colonial import has always concentrated on the political engagement between the collective will of the people and the abstract nation of the notion. But Sri Aurobindo shifts the paradigm from the political to the psychic and the supramental. So therefore he says, and I quote, the primal law and purpose of the individual life is to seek its own self-development. And this self-development at the national level is to locate creation as a living power of the eternal truth, a self-manifesting spirit. Do I have any time? Okay, so therefore I'll just go straight away to the conclusion and say that Sri Aurobindo conceives of a nation being born out of the dissolution of a strong political and administrative control. And he illustrates his point by looking at the evolution of Europe. He observes that the tussle between the church and the state in Europe resulted in the reconfiguration in the ambit of power of the church. Therefore, he believes that the political self-consciousness of India lies in the realization to make India under a secular rather than a religious head. And therefore, when he uses the word secular, of course he basically says that the word secular should mean that India should become spiritually aware rather than becoming religiously dogmatic. So it is Sri Aurobindo who puts at the center the spiritual notion of the nation, rather than the westernized intellectuality which he critiques. And therefore, he says that Eastern spirituality, and this is again much like Rabindranath, that Eastern spirituality and the Western science must meet, and it is only then that a new world order moving towards internationalism can be constructed.